suggesting that I want to get the point across to you in this talk. I wouldn't go so far as to elevate it to the term lecture. I don't feel well prepared enough to call it lecture. But my purpose with this is to elaborate on what the book, in your chapters that you read about the spiritual model of the supernatural model of mental health, I just want to more elaborate and expand on what those chapters said. And my goal isn't so much to give you stuff that you can rattle off and memorize or facts that you can bounce back. I'm more interested in instilling a sense of haptic, kinesthetic feeling about the differences between the world of the Renaissance or a world where you might find the supernatural model of mental health in ascendancy as opposed to our world today, right? So I guess what I'm going to be doing can be described in, the parlance of academic sophistry, what we used to call creative nonfiction, right? So a lot of what I'm doing is based on scholarship, and it's based on past materials, the writings, the concepts that these people would have believed in and integrated their society with. But my purpose is more to instill a sense of a real deep comparison between our world today, which is a secular world, based on physical properties and principles, and laws of physics, and their world, which was based on a cosmogony, that God did indeed create this world. And whether they were esotericists or common religious folk, with their chickens and their crops, on the edge of the fields in the forest somewhere in some medieval Renaissance village, all these people certainly believed in the same worldview, or in variations thereof, right? So even if you find a skeptic back in the 16th century who's very skeptical of witchcraft, very skeptical that demons cause mental illness, even very skeptical that certain imbalances might cause mental illness, these people will believe that those forces still exist in the world. For example, everybody would have more or less accepted, as we accept now, that gravity is gravity created by an alchemist. The gravity is a force that holds us down to the earth. They would have accepted that the rays from the planets and where the planet is in the ascendancy and the hour of the day or night would have had an effect on their mood in one form or another according to the properties of that planet, and that their medicines would have been built from plants and minerals that correspond to those planets. Okay, and it's a very complicated system which I'm not going to entirely break down because I'm not so much interested in communicating exact things that you could recite, because this is your class is an abnormal psychology class, not a religious studies class, not a class in Western esotericism, or in even necessarily in the supernatural view of mental illness. Like I said, I want to get across the idea that this worldview, it was a different world. It felt different. It was different. It was an enchanted world. And everything in this enchanted world was connected, right? And so I think as a thought, maybe it won't go over as funny, but as a thought experiment, just to start you to get your minds working in this manner. So in this old movie, you all know it, the question was raised. So if you went to the Netherlands and you got a quarter pounder with cheese, would they still call it a quarter pounder with cheese, right? And they wouldn't, because they use the metric system in the Netherlands. So there's no quarter pounds. There are no pounds. There are, but do you see what I mean? So if I start to talk to you about the way people integrated with this world, and they would have certainly not thought of mental illness or mental distress or the signs of behaviors that would have caused mental distress, their first go-to would not have been, there's something wrong with that person's brain. There were some physicians that might have carried on the proto-medical model from ancient Greece, Hippocrates, and they might have suggested the humors could be imbalanced. But nobody's first go-to would have been, well, this person's depressed, it must be because their serotonin is imbalanced. They might have said their black bile is imbalanced. But the go-to solutions that we would have not only would not have occurred to them, they didn't exist. We have difficulty imagining a world that's different from ours, because can we imagine a world that exists without the stuff in it that we know exists? So that's kind of what I'm asking you to do. So basically, to start with at the very beginning, we have the 3 or 4 models that you studied in your textbook. We've got the medical model, and that is there's something wrong with the organism that's causing these distressing experiences or behaviors that we see. And it's thrown off, and we got to get it back on. the ancient doctors would have said, Hippocrates, the humors are out of balance. Galen might have interpreted it slightly differently. But they would have had a physical cause, but they would have included some of the other elements that we might have called more arcane. But then you would have had a social model, which we don't have. We have it now, but not in history either. Although there may be certain aspects of the suggested cures for mental illness that require a social construct, where you're using people's relations. If someone's melancholic because they've lost someone close to them, even a medieval doctor or a medieval Renaissance healer would have understood the person's sad because they're in grief, they've lost somebody, and you don't want to let them remain alone. You want to, as we would today, you want to keep people comfortable and companionship. And then we would have had, God, I'm probably going to drop this. So we have the biomedical model, the socioeconomic model, psychological. So here's an interesting thing. If it's a psychological model, what is it exactly that's being treated? What is the psyche? Pretty much our psychological model today is based around the ideas of Descartes. And the psychoanalysts such as Sigmund Freud, you've studied a little bit of him. Maybe you've studied a little bit of Jung and you know about the archetypes. The psychological model is there is an emotional construct or a psyche or something, mental patterns, mental thoughts, that's out of whack. In Freud's case, there was the Trinitarian idea of id, ego, and superego. That most imbalances are a result of childhood trauma, imbalances in the unconscious, too much id, too much superego, and these things cause disorders in people. There almost is a quasi-supernatural aspect to it, but Freud was a scientist, and his method was as much a metaphor as it was a kind of woo-woo seeming spiritual, psychical thing. Jung, the stuff Jung is doing, or Jungian analysts are doing today, may indirectly resemble a supernatural model because he talks about archetypes. And in order to explicate archetypes, he draws on mythological imagery. In a way, the modern occult revival, including the New Age, is entirely the responsibility of C.G. Jung. It was his work that revived the Gnostics. He believed, he had discovered in those ancient Gnostics the proto-psychologists who really could truly heal the soul. Of course, Jung's goals were different from the Gnostics' goals. And I won't go into that too much, but the Gnostics' goals were to free souls trapped in matter, to elevate them in the ascendancy, to escape the earth. Jung's goal was to get somebody back of sound mind and reintegrate them so they can be productive members of society, productive to their families, to their friends, to their co-workers, their church, etc. But the psychological model is, I think, the model that we're most familiar with in our day-to-day experience of feelings and troubles. We have this separate emotional entity that's separate from our body in certain ways, and that the treatment of that has to be affected by emotional means, by talk therapy, even by cognitive behavioral therapy. Those are all designed to treat the psyche. What I'm proposing is an older model, the model that came before all of these, from which all these draw from to some extent, or are a reaction against to some extent. And that is the supernatural model of mental illness. And now what is that? So in a world where you have a level of enchantment and the supernatural, or even the preternatural, because there was an element of that, you have a totally different cosmology. What's ours and what was theirs, okay? Ours basically is this planet, this ball of mud and water and muck and whatever, is spinning around this giant ball of burning plasmated gas, and the gas is combining into other elements and it's spewing out radiation. And all the causes for things can be physically traced either to imbalances in the body that you can see, you can measure it in blood tests, or you can detect it in various organ functions, or brain waves, fMRIs. These are all physical things. Or you would suggest that somehow the thoughts that are resulting are being influenced by these physical things. We live in a very physical world. It's desacralized. There's no, even religious people, I would argue, this is my opinion, perhaps the religious would somewhat disagree with me, but I think I could argue that their religion and their religiosity is a rearguard action, that they are holding on to the remnants of an older worldview that has long since been rejected by us as human beings here in the West, for the better or worse. We decided to reject this model. And yet we didn't quite lose the concept of there being a little something more than just the body and the brain. That even to the atheist, that idea is kind of repellent and unacceptable. And so we have this idea of the psyche. They would have called it the soul. Now, that's not to say the Greeks didn't have a concept of psyche, or that there wasn't some concepts of psychological experience. If you read Augustine, if you read some of the saints, these people were very, very lucid, and they understood how the human mind functions, its thoughts, its thought patterns, its contrary thought patterns, and they were able to map it in a sense, cognitively. But these people would have talked about the soul. And so when you're talking about diseases, physical or mental, you're dealing with a world that includes a whole bunch more factors that have to do with unseen hidden forces, or occult. Occult just means you can't see it. We could make some argument which would be unaccepted by most scientists. Occultism today would be quantum physics. Occultism today would be some of these other force, dark matter, okay? Not because it has anything to do with practicing magic or with practicing astrology or divination, but because these forces are unseen. So having demystified the word occult, now I'm going to mystify it. So in the cosmology of the pre-Age of Reason, your Renaissance, your medieval, and mostly medieval Europe, although the book pointed out very, very beautifully that in Asian cultures, this idea didn't entirely depart, but their Eastern concepts were different from ours, Western. Their concept of chi and energy, a little different from our underlying Western concept of what Elvis Levi would have called astral magic. Okay, don't worry about knowing who he is. Okay, he was a magus in the 19th century. It's only important because he had the concept of energy that, to some extent, sounds Oriental, but it isn't. It's drawn from Western sources. But in this cosmos, one of the sayings that is a good unifying cliche, as above, so below. These people bought into the idea that if you could understand the internal or the external to its fullest, you could understand the disordered processes going on in your patient in front of you. So if you were a physician, you weren't just trained in various medical applications, when do you bleed, when do you purge, will this fever break if it's in the 4th day, when does the crisis occur, etc. They would have had to be astrologers. They would have had to understand that certain diseases, perhaps if the fever is really bad, that's because Mars is in the ascendant, or there's bad air, literally malaria, bad air. They would have believed that the disease would have been arising from noxious vapor. Invisible, of course. You might smell it, but a form of occultism, noxious vapors. Or they might have thought that there was a bad star or a bad comet. And what do I mean by bad? Well, the whole world has a unity to it. So bad just means it's contrary to the proper function or forces that flow into your body that makes it function. What do I mean? If you're really depressed, let's say you're very, very sad, you feel very heavy and leaden, you have little energy, they would have understood that as a Saturnian. Saturn is a planet of lead. Alchemically, lead is the heaviest element. When these people were working on trying to make gold for whatever reason, the Philosopher's Stone to heal, or just gold to get a lot of money and get really rich, Saturn was the metaphor for them to lead. And so the alchemical process is like digestion. You want to break the lead down, reconstitute it into gold. But the alchemical process would have been also a metaphor for digestion. We do this every day. People eat food, you break down the food, and then by some mysterious process, after a period of time, there's no more food there, but all of that essence or energy has been absorbed into your cells. And in some way we don't understand, they want to tell us they do, but they don't. The vitamins, the minerals, etc., have been broken down and reconstituted into you, into your skin, your teeth, your hair, your blood, right? I don't know about you, but that sounds a little occult to me, since they can't explicate exactly how it happens. But so you would have had the idea of planetary influences. So the planetary influences, they all had their own sort of Venus, Mars, Jupiter. We basically, I mean, I have a basic understanding. I'm no astrologer, but we basically have some idea of some of the concepts of these planets. And so along with this, as above, so below, the greater world would have been those planets orbiting the Earth, because they would have thought the Earth was being orbited by the spheres. internally, you would have had assigned to all, and it would have been assigned by either sympathetic correspondences. There would have been some means the planet looked, the planet's light or something about that planet evokes the idea of the planet, of Mars or Jupiter. These metals, herbs, and minerals that they would have drawn on to heal with would have had corresponding astrological sign. So therefore, you're not just going out and getting these medicines and saying, well, I know that if I get some mugwort and I get some sorrel and I get some sweet gale, okay, I know those are Venetian plants, okay, and they'll work because of these chemicals in the plant. No, they would have, not only would they have been aware that these plants are under the sign, as it were, the protection of these planets, but they would have had to harvest it when that planet was in the ascendant. You don't just go out and grab it. You wait until a certain hour, the hour of Venus, and you wait until that planet is in the ascendant and it's rising through the heavens, because that's your astrology. Why? Because the forces are more aligned. So you have to have some idea of how the planets align to bring good and bad fortune as well, because it could bring good and bad health into your life. So the plants would have been harvested under the hour of Venus. And then when you prepare them, you have to grind the plants up at a certain time. You can't just go home and say, yep, it's time to grind up my, just because I feel like starting it. You would have had to wait another 12 hours, or you would have had to wait a certain span of time until the stars are right again. Then you would have begun the process. And the thing is, making medicines in those days, it took a long, long, long time. You would have had to wait many hours. So you would have to calculate, this should finish at this time. Because what if you finish under the wrong planetary sign? Then you confound your medicine. It wouldn't have occurred to them, okay, that, oh, the medicine doesn't care. It has no connection to the reflection of the sunlight bouncing off the planet, which is utterly meaningless. It means absolutely nothing. So the plant, I just do whatever. No, because they were acutely aware. It has to be in alignment. It all must be aligned. And I think the book actually got that concept across fairly well. So what would you say in the spiritual, the supernatural model of mental illness? Well, you'd have to evaluate the different influences that could be causing these imbalances. And of course, in these days, they were Christian, and their worldview was. And if you've even read the Bible even a little, you know that the Bible is full of healing plants that you can use, but why were those plants valuable and important? And it wasn't because the biblical sages who wrote that understood that these plants had healing phytoestrogens in them, or they had these quercetin. They would have believed that they had healing properties, because in the original crucifixion of Christ, or in some manner or other, for example, frankincense and myrrh, the wise men brought them to baby Jesus. They were gifts for this, and they might have had some idea of their healing properties, which is why they knew they were valuable. But the plant's healing properties don't come from the plant itself, they come from Christ and the way that they were used in his life during the Gospels. For instance, there was one, I don't remember the plant, I don't know if it was hyssop or if it was something else, but when healers would harvest this plant and they would pick it from the ground, they would have to recite an incantation, right? And they would have to recite this incantation, reciting why the plant is useful, why it is needed in this time for the healing that it's necessary to do. And it was something to the effect of, I pluck thee from the ground as thou didst staunch the blood that flowed at Calvary in the wounds of Christ. I pluck thee from the ground to do the same, and you will heal this person as you healed the Savior on Mount Calvary. And that's because you're kind of reenacting the cosmogony. So there's an element to healing, and it would include mental health and restoration of mental health. That's a sort of reenactment of the creation, a reenactment of your place in the universe. And what is that place? You're in a Christian universe. You have to be in alignment with Jesus, and you have to be in alignment with his teachings, you know, very loosely and colloquially put, do as he would do. And so you're drawing from sympathetic magic or from sympathetic correspondence, the same as you do from the correspondences of those higher planets. So again, I reiterate, as above, so below. In the book, you have the book of life. The book of life's written in the world, in the land, in the stars. And that would have been a concept that went all the way back to the Neoplatonists and further. Although the Greeks' medical knowledge was based on the four humors, and Hippocrates was a naturalist, they wouldn't have rejected the influence of maleficent air, nor would they have entirely written out the idea of maleficent stars or comets. And Hippocrates himself talked about when you establish a new settlement, be sure that the wind is blowing from the right quarter and that you're on the right elevation of land so that you're not getting the bad air coming from, they believed ill omen and ill elements could come from swamps, and they could, like a mist, and the diseases would come in the fog. So keeping in mind that, another idea that the book touched on that was very popular and went out of control during the witch trials was the idea of demons, demonic intervention. You have a universe where, even though Christ ascended and was triumphant and you have the Holy Spirit, the battleground is for the souls of men. So you have the idea, if there's a break in that, illnesses could be caused by any number of issues, but sometimes they might just be caused by demons that are tormenting, or by witches and witchcraft. They would have all accepted the idea of natural magic. They wouldn't have understood the healing came from, as I said, vitamins, minerals, they would have considered that the restoration was done through natural magical means. And so if somebody's quarreling with you, or they're behaving in a manner that's cantankerous, maybe somebody with what we would call now today oppositional defiance order, or antisocial personality disorder, perhaps. Somebody who's always unpleasant to be around, someone who's always sort of casting aspersions on people. That would have been looked upon then, not as a personality disorder, not as something that you could trace from a traumatic childhood. They would have looked upon it more as perhaps the influence of maleficent demons. If the person is breaking the Sabbath, if they're not going to prayers, or if they're not giving proper charity or alms or something, they're behaving antisocially, right? It would have been assumed that they were of the devil, or that in some way they approved of the devil's work. And the devil's work was to seduce the soul, so that you would lose it. There's an aspect of ill health in general, and it would include mental health, wherein you might have other imbalances or forces that could be given to other supernatural agents. But there would have been a worldview that wouldn't have been capable of being, as we are as scientists, scientific. Though the alchemists, and this is another interesting point, they had the proto-technology for distilling drugs. And they understood extracting. They would have understood if you took opium and you ground it up and you extracted it. They understood something was being extracted from the opium. We would have understood it today as the narcotic, the opiates, your various opiate drugs, your thebaine, your codeine, your morphine. Paracelsus wouldn't have understood these things, but what he would have understood is that of the four elements on the earth, fire, water, air, for Paracelsus, sulfur, mercury, and salt, there is a fifth element called quintessence. And it is this element that influences us from the stars. It's this element that they would have extracted when they first figured out how to brew alcohol, extracting spirits, whiskey. Alcohol was originally an Arabic word from alchemical processes where they extracted it. They thought it was a universal solvent. But they understood it as we're extracting the quintessence of this, the actual spirit of this, whether it's vegetable or mineral. We're getting the ultimate primary prima materia, okay? The foundation of what makes this stuff. And they wouldn't have classified it chemically. They would have classified it spiritually. They would have classified it within the worldview that says the world was created by a divine entity, and that in all cases the divine is present, or that there are higher forces that are moving these things around or influencing their growth or decay. So I think for the moment I've kind of given a good outline. I don't know for how long I've spoken, but I want to open it up a little more to discussion or to questions. Some of the questions you've asked were very, very good ones. I was highly impressed. And I kind of want to open it up to expand. You've read the chapters, and my purpose here is to elaborate on what the book said, so that you can have a better picture of the differences that the book was pointing out. So I want to open it up more now to discussion. If that's okay with you, Chris?
Sure.
Is this a timely moment to do this?
Sure.
Okay. So sure. So feel
You're
free.
in control.
Okay. So feel free. Chris can help
Sure.
me see. Thank you.
Any questions up to this point?
That could add. You want me to elaborate?
I have a question.
Okay.
I don't know, like, how fully appropriate it would be, but some people say, who've believe in the supernatural or God, Christian, all those different things, who do any degree relating to science, say that they feel this conflict, right? Like that sometimes what we're learning, and I guess in this context, the biological models and all those different ones, and then having the other perspective, do you personally feel the conflict, and how do you kind of learn those two different ones and then make a middle of it? Does that make sense?
Do you mean the conflict between religion and science, or the conflict between
religion,
an older worldview and our modern worldview?
Both, because I understand that the older worldview influences our modern worldview, but there are people who feel that it's stronger influence and less than science, right? Like there's different arguments that all different people would make. So where is sort of the middle, you know?
I'm not sure I can give a straight up direct answer, a concrete answer, because there is a conflict, and I think it's been exacerbated since the beginning of the Protestant and Catholic split in Christianity. It wasn't there in some of the older philosophers and theologians, Christian or Jewish or Muslim, that you would find. You would never find a Maimonides, for instance, or an Avicenna, who they were both physicians. None of them would see a conflict between scientific principles as they would see it as science, higher reason is what they would probably refer to it as, rational principles, and their religiosity. There wouldn't have been a conflict between those two forces as opposed forces against one another. They would have seen the one as the verification of the other from both directions, right? The scientific rules that they found, the regularity in the cosmos, the ideas of when you do boil this to a certain point and you grind it up and you distill this happens, and it happens the same every time. That wasn't the scientific method, rather, that was demonstration that the uniformity in the world is the sign that there was a creator, that there was a hand who organized these principles. And in the other direction, correspondingly, religiosity, believing in God, etc. It didn't necessarily negate that you used reason and that you utilized principles that we would call scientific or physical now.
It's in front of you.
Oh, it is?
Straight ahead.
There would not be this conflict. This conflict is artificial. And it's largely a modern construct. And I would make the argument that we don't have a war between what we would think of as science and as religion until the 18th, 19th century, when you had the Age of Reason. For they were trying to disenchant the world. And it was they who sought to differentiate between, people that are delusional, who believe in ghosts or whatever, and our world. And that's another, we have the idea sometimes that superstition, the variant of the idea of supernatural, superstition. Well, these are stupid, somehow misguided, benighted people that they're associating disconnected fragments and connecting them. And there are forms of mental illness that's one of the criterion for their diagnosis, right? So I think there's some willingness in the secular world to condemn the whole thing and just say, you know what, they were all a bunch of primitives, they were savages. But I mean, I can definitely, and I want to demonstrate to you too, I even Chris has included some additional material if you want to follow up on this. That demonstrates that these people were exceptionally highly intelligent and highly sophisticated. And they were not a bunch of dupes who believed the world was flat the way our flat earthers do today, right? Our flat earthers really are a bunch of knuckle-headed fools, right? Well, they are. I mean, so there wouldn't have been as much of a distinction in a supernatural world. They would have been just as happy to look at a case and say, well, it's very probable that there are certain things that could be out of balance, and we need to rebalance them. So we can give them some of these elements. We can change their diet a little bit, perhaps. We can, or they might have said, well, we know that this person's astrology, this person's chart, their location, the plants that are in the planets that are ascendant. Well, we can counteract some of that bad astrological influence with these herbs that fall under the auspices of different planets that would counteract that. And they would have given some allowance for, well, could this be demonic influence? Could it be witchcraft? And they would have had their own criterion for trying to measure all of these things. But there would not have been a conflict. Not then. Conflict is now. The breakdown between science and religion was nothing that either party sought until after the Age of Reason, which in my opinion, after the Age of Reason, because their raison d'etre was destroy the superstition and get rid of religion. disenchant the world. I mean, that's a reason to enter it. So I kind of think that the science, religion, dogma dispute that we've been caught in for the past few hundred years has only existed for that long.
Wow. Thank you so much for answering that.
Sure.
So I have a question.
Mhm.
Do you think someone more prone to abnormal psychology may be affected by occultism more so like in a negative way than those with abnormal psychology? And how do you think that occultism can contribute to the degradation of a person's psyche?
Well, I mean, the short answer, I suppose, would be yes. But I think that's ultimately because you're dabbling in ideas that if you're an unbalanced mind, those ideas could make suggestions that feed into your delusion. If you're dealing with occultism and you get a sense that you have some kind of special role in the cosmos and that you're going to do this magical rite and transform yourself into some shining being, or that you believe that you've awakened your chatbot somehow and that you're tapping into the universal Akashic record or something. I do think, because in some of these ideas, they're very exotic and they're hard to integrate, and you can have exceptionally vivid emotional experiences and results if you look too deeply into these things. So in a word, in the short answer, yeah. I mean, and I think there's actually a form in the DSM-5 of mental breakdown that's called something like magical, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, is magical thinking as its own sort of diagnosis.
Magical thinking is usually criteria for some particular.
Well, but I mean, no, there literally is a mental diagnosis of where somebody that doesn't have such beliefs suddenly begins to have magical thinking, esoteric beliefs that aren't a result of their culture or their prior religious experiences or even their contemporary interests. I saw it in the DSM-5. I know it's in there. I read this cluster of symptoms that described this. So I suppose, I mean, it's really not, I'm not an authority to answer per se, but yeah, I would have to say that in a word, yes, it would, and if by corrupting, if you mean increased destabilization, increased emotional dysregulation, a misguided sense of one's place in the world that's exaggerated or that's distorted, occultism, yes, it could lead you to some really strange conclusions that could be destructive in the wrong person, in an unhealthy mind, yes.
See, I think you were first.
I was wondering, do you think that we kind of took a step backward in psychology when we separated the two?
I'm not sure I follow what you mean.
Like the almost supernatural thinking and like the more scientific way. Do you think the separation kind of made us like more closed-minded?
Do you mean we've lost something by taking that step?
Yeah.
Well, again, I have to say yes in a word, but I think this way because we still have psychoanalysts like C.G. Jung. We still have some therapists out there that are trying to use more holistic principles in their healing modalities, including dreams, dream interpretation, how you feel with the dream. I think we did, but on the other hand, I also think there is something to be said for the strength of having a very simplistic, very down-to-earth, pragmatic cure for mental illnesses that could still be effective, i.e. your cognitive behavioral therapies. And they deal with the mind and with its reactions to certain things. But I'm not really qualified to answer. This is only my opinion. I'm not a psychologist or a clinician or a healer. I don't know. From my perspective, I think something was sacrificed or misplaced or thrown out with the bathwater. But that's only my opinion. I'm only qualified to say that just because I think we would have a more holistically balanced populace recovering from mental distress if we included more elements that integrated them more into the world, even if it's only metaphorical for them. You tell somebody that's trying to go on a healing journey of emotional dysregulation, as above, so below, the outer is likened to the inner, and you need to make these things align. Well, how do you do that? Well, you can go out into the outer natural world and try to use it and its laws and its, even something like going out into the sunlight, even something like trying to experience nature and fresh air. And even if we know now it's negative ions and that green spaces can induce bodily rejuvenation to some extent, we should be including these elements in our psychological healing modalities. But I don't feel qualified to make a definite statement.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, sir. I wanted to get your take on hypnotherapy and the dive into the subconscious and the
Okay, cool.
idea of diving into maybe possibly past lives.
Oh, sure, okay. I don't know anything about. So what do you want me to try to? Were you asking me, is it credible or is it authentic or what's your question?
So it would be considered a supernatural psychology.
Oh, yes.
Portion.
Oh,
I
for
know
sure it
that
would,
they
yes.
use it nowadays. It's
Mhm.
a modern use. Is
But
it
it's a
effective?
subgroup, it's a very small subgroup. But yeah, that might be an example of, that sounds like working that you would do with a Jungian or someone derived from the Jungian tradition. Shadow work, past lives, all that stuff sounds like it would be integrated more into a Jungian sort of framework. As far as hypnosis, I mean, I guess the short answer would be, hypnosis comes originally from Robert Anton Mesmer, okay, and he didn't think he was putting people into a sleep so they could connect to a twilight sleep to open up to their subconscious mind. He thought he was integrating them with animal, what he called it, the animal force, right? Again, a kind of energy that imbues everything, everything that has that's physical. It would have been more metaphysical for Mesmer, but the psychologists, Jung and Freud and others, learned from esotericists how to do this, and they were able to get people to, behave in certain ways, ignore pain. We have traditions that go back thousands of years in the East, where you have the fakir, or you have firewalkers. You have people who can get themselves into these deep trances where they're not affected by pain, or even where they experience possessions, and they can show supernatural strength, feats of great strength, or even precognition. So they're tapping into this through the esotericists. I always had a feeling that, especially Jung, I always thought he was more of a modern day magician than an actual psychologist or physician. But he had to make up ways to get by all the materialist hardliners in his field, including Freud, with whom he had an irreparable break. And because Jung was Freud's disciple. And the main disagreement between them that broke them apart was the idea of this supernatural. And in Jung, the idea of the collective unconscious is kind of an Akashic record. So he sort of did delve more into that supernatural. I'm not sure I've answered your question fully, or?
It did, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sir, are the historical examples where religious or philosophical traditions successfully integrated care for the mentally ill in ways that modern clinical psychologists can learn from? For instance, monastic healing practices, ritual confession, or like faith-based community approaches?
Oh yes, I think so. Well, but ultimately, let's target that for a moment. That's brilliant. Thank you for opening that. What is it when you go to confess, right? I mean, I'm not a Catholic. I mean, you might need to illuminate me on this a little, Chris, but basically when you go to your confessor, you want to purify yourself from your sins, and you want to make sure that you're right with God, and that will make that go away, and that would inevitably make your distress lessen as well. You go to your confessor and you say, well, Father, I'm a sinner, I've sinned, I've had thoughts in an impure manner. Well, what are those thoughts, my son? I've wanted to kill myself. I've wanted to harm myself, and I'm full of anger and melancholy, and and part of the confession would include, well, if we need you to say these prayers, and we'll take you into our monastery maybe, and we'll say some rituals over some healing. Well, maybe we'll say a mass over you. Maybe we'll do some means of an anti-demonic ritual. Maybe we'll even go so far as to do a kind of exorcism over you to try to get you to feel more in alignment and less distressed. The idea of going to your counselor today and, well, is that not a form of secular confession? Have we not replaced the confessional with this construct called therapy? But it's really just a reiteration and lacking the framework to really correctly do so. Unless you have absolute trust in your therapist, you're recreating the confessional in a secular manner. It's not your sins that you're confessing to have absolution. It's your mental disharmony that you're hoping this person can fix through tactics and techniques of retraining your brain, tactics and techniques of reevaluating and reinterpreting your emotional state so that it isn't as negative even though you're not feeling any better. you're not reacting as negatively to it, I would say that's a form of secular confessional. And I think that, yeah, if mental hospitals, if drug rehab facilities, for example, that's probably why they, and I think in a lot of cases it might have good intent, but be fraudulent. But look, the idea of having someone who's recovering from drugs be around animals, animal therapy, that sort of is almost like tapping back into this older viewpoint, is it not? And integrating those elements. Did that address what you were?
Yes.
Okay, sure.
Next question. I have a question.
Okay.
So, you talked a little bit about sort of the remaining or the residual aspects in our modern world of the supernatural.
Yeah.
But talk more specifically on the mind-body duality, the Cartesian model, and how that affects us now. And you probably want to explain exactly what it is too.
Well, I'll try. And this is really my opinion, right? Because I'm not sure, I don't know how many other scholars have kind of looked at it this way and tried to give it a wider cultural analysis. But René Descartes, I mean, basically the mind-body problem that we're dealing with, and so by extension, the hard problem of consciousness. Mind-body problem basically says in Descartes, you have the mind and the body. Although the brain is in your head and your brain is part of your body, the mind is not part of your brain, although somehow it's in your brain, and it's in your head, and your brain's in your body. But that there is an irreparable separation, it can't be connected. Your mind is not your body. That even though in our more modern day world, because Descartes didn't reject the soul, but in our modern world we have, but we're still Cartesian. We still, when we seek treatment, wanting to treat the mind, right? Our first thought is, if I'm mentally ill, first of all, the first thought is, there's a mental part of me. Somehow it's not connected to my body, but it's mental. That is sick. Sick how? Well, I have anxiety. Okay, that must be all from the mental. And it is the Cartesian dualism. The dualism says that your mind and body, although separate, although the harm to the body cannot damage the mind, nor can the mind affect the body. I've never quite grasped this because I don't, how can something not connected to your body influence it, move it, channel its emotions, etc. But if we're to take the psychological model, and that might have been largely what Jung and Freud and others were working with even early on, although there would have been materialists who would have rejected this for the practical common sense, William James, for instance. When you're treating someone's psyche, you're treating that separate aspect. You're treating that mind faculty that is in some means that we don't understand, disconnected, separate, but not apart from the body, that you're solely and exclusively treating that by emotional means. Am I floundering, or am I on the right track here for your question?
Yeah, no. Let's see. So, is that a problem? The idea that people consider the mind separate from the body?
I think it's a big problem, because to me, I'm more of a materialist, but I'm also more holistic. The idea that something that is separate and just floats around is a little homunculus. It's not allowed to really control anything, but it's solely responsible for your haptic experience of emotionality. It's solely responsible for your thoughts, the thoughts you don't even know where they're coming from. And then, where do you go after the talk therapy doesn't quite fix it? You go to get your antidepressants. I think it's a big problem when you have the disintegration. You're not treating the whole person. A lot of the mental illnesses could be treated very directly and successfully with physical means. You reduce someone's inflammation, immediately their thoughts will change. And what I would be concerned with as a criticism of modern psychology, if it doesn't include some of these other more holistic elements, you're ruling out a pathway to treatment that might be as simple as readjusting a holistic medicine, functional medicine, somebody's nutrient balance. Reducing somebody's inflammation seems to have tremendous effects on elevating their moods. And if you're just focused on the mind, if you're just focused on, it's only the mental psyche that I'm trying to rearrange, to balance, and you're excluding these other issues, you're giving the patient a less effective treatment and fewer pathways to health, I mean, in my opinion.
True. Although it is always important to kind of eliminate, physical issues that are affecting the mind, right? Like
Yes.
Thyroid problems, for example, and depression, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Another question.
So I'm an Orthodox Christian,
Okay.
and this kind of surrounds Orthodoxy because it's mystical. I feel like it's tied to Christian esoterica.
Yes, especially Orthodox, because in Orthodoxy, everything is universalized. Every soul, no matter how cruel, even Satan's, is redemptible.
Yes, sir. So surrounding that, do you think that secular psychology pathologizes suffering too much?
Yes.
Whereas Orthodoxy reframes it as transformative?
I don't know about Orthodox reframing it. I do think they pathologize life. The difficulties in life may be a little too much, but I mean, I'm not qualified to make a sweeping statement such as that without saying that's kind of my opinion. Where they're pathologizing, I think they go too far to label people with disorders who don't have disorders. They might have imbalances and problems that are causing them distress. But as far as the Orthodox view as a remedy, I can't speak to that. I personally would think if a person is in that worldview, that they would find solace and healing in their religion. I think that could bring the person a lot of support and a lot of meaning. Because I think we do find that what really helps people reconstitute their responses to their suffering and their stressors is the meaning of suffering and is that wider view. We don't have that in a secular world. And so I think that does lead people to paying a high price. But again, I'm also not religious. I'm a religious scholar. But I think, yes, how you would integrate that into a more secular psychology and still have it be neutral enough for everyone to derive benefits from, I'm uncertain of. But I'm not sure I've answered, but I tend to think very positively about religious worldviews in general.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Once you get your hands up.
This is kind of connected to this.
Okay.
Could you speak up, please?
Yeah, sorry. So it's kind of connected in the same area, but would you say that this model, like the mind and the body, does it come from Christianity? Would
Yes.
you say? Because it's like do not believe in your own understanding and that the body.
Oh, that I
can be
can't
yours?
speak to. Theologically, it could. That's a good observation. My response is based on the separation between soul and body is directly from Christianity and the Greek aspect of Christianity. The idea that it is your soul that requires saving. Your body is just a temporary vessel, the vehicle for you to achieve salvation or whatever. We're in this world for only a short time and then we're in heaven. Yeah. I mean, sorry, would you mind elaborating on your question a little more? Or?
Yeah, basically just like the thought of like not believing in your own understanding that it's like something bigger. Like if this kind of correlates to like the mind being separate from the brain. If that makes sense.
I
don't
don't
really know
know.
how to.
I think I know what you mean. I don't know. Well, because you have a safeguard in Christianity that tells you don't trust your own ego or your own mind too much. I'm not sure there's a correlate.
That was just my question. If you thought there was a correlation.
I'm not sure I can draw one from that. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know. I haven't I don't think I have quite the level of insight to connect to that question. Well, I don't know. Chris, do you?
No.
No. Okay. I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't know.
Got another question for you guys.
Okay.
Again, about religion,
Mhm.
but based on your studies on religion and your interest in the occult,
Sure.
would you say that religion is the root of the many cults throughout time? And if so, why is that?
Root of cults. I'm not sure I follow. Are
I
you?
feel like I'm very into like documentaries about everything.
Okay.
But I watch a lot of documentaries about cults, and I feel like they always get back to some religion, not
Right.
always Christianity, but
Yeah.
it's always rooted in religion in some way.
Yes, because religion has great power subconsciously for us. Even if we're secular, those images have tremendous authority and power. Our culture is Christian. I know it's risky for me to say that, but Western culture is Christian culture. And so even in our modern world, the framework, maybe now somewhat the demolished framework, but it's still there. That shape of things is still there. But if do you mean by cults, is religion and religiosity the source of mental illness, in that cults are basically dysfunctional relationships of the many in the cult with the founder? Has religion always created forms of mental illness? And I'm not sure I quite know the answer to that, because as long as there's been religions, there have been small breakaway groups, there have been sects, there have been groups of people who were isolated, there have been societies of esotericists who tried to enact in praxis various theologies that took them into really weird behaviors and really strange theologies, and they would have appeared insane from the outside. I don't know. I think religion has always inspired groups to follow esotericism for power, the pursuit of healing, power, wisdom. But I think the modern cult phenomena, as in religious cults, is another form of modern breakdown of society. And a cult, I mean, if we get past all the weird concepts and the weird behaviors that they make people do, ultimately, really, what is a cult? It's a dysfunctional relationship whereby the cult leader has indoctrinated, brainwashed, gaslit, browbeat, intimidated, and abused, physically, mentally tortured, in the same manner that in a dysfunctional spouse or a dysfunctional family. To me, the religiosity of the cult isn't what makes it sane or insane, criminal or legal, acceptable or unacceptable in social circles in society. It's the manner in which the adherents of that religious group are treated by the founder. And therein lies the mental illness and instability. If you have a cult founder who has an antisocial personality disorder, I mean, you're going to have a group of very, very hurt, indoctrinated people, and that's not necessarily the result of the doctrines that they're drawing upon, even if they're distorted, warped, and ultimately alien doctrine that wider society can't accept. For example, Heaven's Gate, right? So I don't want to blame religion necessarily, or religiosity, or this worldview as the sole source for doomsday cults, even though they're deriving their reason d'etre from the scripture, and they're justifying their strange behaviors with scripture that they've either taken out of context or reinterpreted for their own ends. You follow?
Yeah.
Sure.
So, real quickly, you mentioned that most of the beliefs have been based on Western religions.
Well, and I think the book took pains to point that out. It's really more of a Western analysis of the Western supernatural model, but they talked a little bit about Eastern as well.
Eastern, I was going to bring up if there was any influences from Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism in our modern day view.
In our modern day view, perhaps Buddhism, but I don't think I've pinned down entirely what you mean by modern day view. Like our secular view of psychology, does it incorporate Buddhist principles? It could, and there'd be no conflict, because Buddhism, especially the Theravada Buddhism, you're not talking about a religious system. You're talking about a secular, almost science of consciousness, whose purpose is to liberate you from samsara. And in a sense, part of your psychological distress is because you've held on too much to the desires, to the cravings, to what the Buddhists would have diagnosed as imbalances. You're pursuing these other pleasures. But what you ought to be trying to do is suppress your ego that's causing these imbalances and trying to focus on calm, meditative calm. So there would have been perhaps a psychological stabilizing element for Buddhists. I can't say for sure, for certain. I think there'd be affinity, but I can't say the whole modern worldview drew from Eastern traditions directly, piecemeal or whatnot. You understand what I mean?
Yes.
But there could be traces of it. There'd be less conflict between Buddhism and healing the psyche per se than, say, Christian Science and healing the psyche. There'd be a lot less conflict in a modern practitioner of psychology, perhaps, with Buddhist concepts than with some of the more extreme or rare Christian aspects. Prayer will heal, but the person being prayed over doesn't have to do the work, because the prayer will do the fixing. I think there's more conflict between that than secular psychology taking up Buddhist concepts that are trying to weaken the negative elements of your ego that are driving you to ill behavior or to imbalanced psychological judgments. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
And there has been a lot of Buddhism sort of incorporated directly or indirectly via mindfulness, radical acceptance, that type of
Oh,
thing.
indeed.
So-
Yeah, you're right. See, I'm not as qualified as Chris to connect those two things.
So yeah, there has been a lot that's kind of been incorporated. Although I don't think, no, I think in a lot of cases it actually is sort of tagged as Buddhist. But there are a lot of concepts that do show up. Yeah.
This might be a broad question, just let me know if it is.
Okay.
But I think the abject reality is that in Western culture, our moral compass, and I think it's wound throughout our DNA throughout the West, is based on Christian values.
Sure.
And I think that contributes to cultural norms and values. Do you think the removal and the secularization of the West, or like basically like the push for moral relativism, is inherently like a slippery slope?
Yes, I think it's very destructive. I don't, but that's my personal opinions, and I don't like the idea of, you need to have a stabilized background framework. And I mean, in psychology possesses the idea of moral responsibility. Psychology addresses the idea of taking responsibility. So if you're a drug addict, for instance, we still have a strong drive in the curing of that patient from their drug addiction. You must accept responsibility for your actions, even though we can say, yeah, the illness made you do it, yeah, the drug made you do it, yeah, well, but you're still responsible. And so I think the loss of morality will weaken the treatment psychology can provide, not necessarily because the morals are changing, but because there isn't universality. I think Kant was very right. When you have a society functioning in a universal way, you need to have universal principles, and that would include in psychology a medical praxis that heals people. It has to have universal ideals in place in order to even determine that you have healed and benefited, and now you're reintegrated ultimately in a healthy way with your community. And I think that includes universal forms of morality, even if it's only just a secular sense of, stand up and take responsibility for your own treatment, take your own life into your own hands. Is that enough to replace it? I don't know. I suspect someone who's religious would want to have a religious counselor who is trained in these tactics and these techniques, but from that particular worldview, that they'd gain more benefit from that than from a secular counselor. But that's simply the principle in counseling of meet the patient that you have where they are and try to find the best match for that patient. Am I addressing the answer or meandering?
Yes, sir. I think so.
But I really don't like the modern trends that are breaking down our universals, and that includes moral relativism.
I had a question,
Okay.
maybe a bit off-sided, but it's in regards to like treatment
Okay.
from the different models, and especially from the spirituality.
Sure.
Long story short, I'm Australian, so actually I don't know how it is here in
You're
America.
Australian? No way.
Nah.
But I don't know. Anyway, and if you, as a clinical psychologist, if you use
I'm not a clinical psychologist.
no, sorry, I'm just saying like pretend that there's a
Okay,
clinical
sure,
psychologist.
sure.
In Australia, you will lose your license if you use spirituality or religion in terms of your healing treatment.
They're that severe.
That's severe.
Okay.
Like like APRA will take away your license if you start to, use it in your treatment. And so again, maybe this is not as applicable if it's not the same if clinical psychs are speaking about religion in their treatment. So I don't know how it is here. But we spoke about beforehand on how it was not really quite separated, and it was as the healing. Now that that's really kind of taking away, especially with psychologists, do you think that that is inhibiting treatment and inhibiting like things to be fixed?
I personally, yes.
Yeah.
I do, because the big thing that we lose when we're mentally unwell is our sense of meaning and our sense of balance and purpose. I don't know, perhaps I'm taking a risk saying such a broad statement. I don't know how defensible that is, Chris, but it is the sense of meaning that needs to be restored in that person in order for them to reintegrate, in order for them to find a new kind of balance, to have health. And I think when you're tying someone's hands, you're restricting them. But I don't know. I also do think there's some grounds to criticize purely spiritual, purely, treatment modalities. The woo-woo, hippy-dippy, we'll go to the sweat lodge and, we'll burn some sage over you and, but I think it's not the government's business in your country or any other what's going on between a clinician and their patient. I don't think they should legislate what they can draw upon in their treatment and write laws restricting them from doing it.
Right.
I mean, that's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
But I would say, yes, for clinicians in your country, you're losing a tool in your toolkit
Right.
that you could benefit from using, even if you didn't lean on it heavily or often.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of a shame.
Yeah. Thank you for your insight.
Sure.
Questions? All right, I have a question. I'm going to paraphrase and change the question a little bit.
Okay.
Because it's something that you and I have talked about.
Okay.
And so I feel like you will have a pretty interesting take on it. So let's see. So ignoring motives involving personal gain such as property or titles, what were the factors in the execution of witches? And more importantly, or most importantly, were the judges who prosecuted the witches just superstitious and irrational?
See, here's the interesting thing. Those judges might have been superstitious, but they were not unlearned. They might have been irrational, but they were not unlettered and unaware. They would have had a degree of learning that we can't even imagine today, okay? That I can't even comprehend. So the judges that judged, say, the Salem witch trials, they would have drawn on everything from the testimony of witnesses to spectral evidence to, the devil's mark even, okay? But if Cotton Mather were to walk in this room today, the man understood like 7 languages fluently. Biblical Hebrew, Greek, perhaps Aramaic, perhaps Coptic. He would have been very well educated. Latin, German, French. They would have had a level of literary awareness of the texts of their time. They would have read all the major theologians. They would have understood the scientists. They would have understood, these were not backward, dim-witted. Look, Increase Mathers created Harvard University. Harvard, right? If we're going to look back on them and condemn them for the witch trials, if we're going to condemn them for killing people who were probably delusional or who were suffering from some kind of personality disorder or some sort of anxiety or bipolar delusions, if we're going to condemn them for it, it's got to be from the right perspective, so the ammunition that we fire at them hits its target more effectively. If we just damn them and say, well, they were ignorant, stupid, superstitious numbskulls, and we just have to damn them all because they were all insane, we're kind of missing the point. We should be afraid of witch trials. We should look back on this with horror, because these people were highly polished, well educated, and they understood human nature very, very, very well. We'd think that they didn't. How could they do? No, it's not true. If you read some of these older theologians, you get the strong impression that their comprehension of how the human psyche works, and they were obsessed with sinfulness, which is a rupture from God, is a separation from the divine. What sort of psychological processes do you need to undergo so that that sinfulness manifests? They did not lack understanding, human insight. They did not lack, look at Shakespeare. Those people would have all, late 1500s, I don't know how the Puritans would have felt about the Globe Theater. They probably wouldn't have been too happy with it. But all these people would have had a sophistication to a level and degree, I believe, exceeding ours today, in spite of the stuff in their worldview that we reject. And so when we're evaluating what they chose to do, it really has to be in the light, the full light of, this wasn't a backward world. This was a civilization, a vibrant and rich civilization, and that these people were as sophisticated as our Carl Jung, as our Carl Rogers. I mean, I don't know if I'm fully addressing or answering your question.
Yeah, I mean, really the question is, kind of what you said, are these just sort of dim-witted, backwards?
Yeah, not at all.
People who didn't.
No, not at all. They weren't numb as a pounded thumb. Throw her in the water, she sinks. She's a witch. Even though they would have thrown her in the water. That's why we should be horrified. That there were people of that degree. And we should ask ourselves, in our world today, how is this manifesting? And it would be much harder for us to see because we swim in the waters. But there are elements in our culture today that are reiterations of the same errors that they committed, that we look upon and cast aspersions upon because they were errors. And they're committing it now. How are they doing so? That's what we should, our lesson should be that, in one sense.
I have a follow-up question from that.
Okay.
I don't know how fully related that is, but thank you first of all for that perspective, because I was definitely like, what idiots, right? And then when you really explain how the capacity of their knowledge was, like even just you'd see someone this day and age with 7 languages, you'd
Yeah,
think
it exceeds ours.
Right. So then what I was following that is, and I don't know if this is speaking from a really educated perspective, right? But people speak about how our brain has only unlocked such a small capacity that we have. Like some people say that like your brain, we only use 20% of what it could be.
And that was a misquotation that became a popular phrase.
It's not really, so you're saying?
Oh, yeah, look, when have we ever not used all of our brains at all moments?
I don't know.
You mean 80% of it up there, it's just, I think what the phrase originally was, I think it was even Einstein who said it, we're only aware at this time of what 10 or 20% of our brain is doing at any one time at the moment. And that became mistranslated in popular culture as 10% of our brain is actively in use, and the rest of it is locked in inert. That's a misquotation.
Oh, right. The only reason why I thought of that in connection to what you're saying is because if these people in this past world, right, had such insight that we may be lacking, then what, how, why, like what's the difference? Like I was thinking from now that you've corrected it, but I was thinking, do you think that they had more of an unlocked of their brain, that they have these insights that we don't
I
have
just
these
think
days?
they had better connections. In their world, I think in certain aspects, I don't want to romanticize it, but in some ways their world was healthier than ours. People had better sleep. People had more sovereignty in their. I think there were elements of the way people lived back then. And it's hard to say that because the first thing we see when we look back is, oh, but a cut on your finger will kill you. They threw their slop out the window into the road. Oh my God! And I think that there are elements of their society which we've lost in ours that we could reintegrate without reenacting their society and its foibles that we could benefit from.
Right.
I do think that. I think to some extent you see that, and people are more willing now to, more likely, I am. If there's a psychological issue they're dealing with along with their treatment, they would rather use natural medicine as opposed to reaching for an antidepressant or an SSRI or something. They would rather try to use holistic means of correcting the healing of the body in the hopes that the mind would have an easier time healing itself. I guess I'm answering your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely, thank you.
Sure.
I was wondering, do you know anything about like the Native American civilizations, like the Aztecs, Incas?
Very little. I mean, but I know a little. Probably not enough to incorporate it into this discussion about psychology. But I mean, I have a basic knowledge of, a very basic knowledge.
I was just wondering, like, do you think they had sort of like psychology aspects in that? Because I know that they
must have had
a pretty high civilization.
Yeah, they must have had. They must have done. I mean, I couldn't say. I'd be speculating wildly. I've not seen. I don't think we have healers in the Aztec. You know, we've got the priests. They take the mushrooms and they'd see the visions, and most people would take them with them. And I guess I don't know. I don't know enough about it, and I could be wrong. I don't know if we have enough of their culture preserved to be able to label. I think in general, scholars of religion or historians of psychology or historians of religion would want to say in general terms that the shaman served as the healer, the psychologist, the spiritual the protector. You know, he could do the counter maleficent magic or attacks from evil spirits. That in these more indigenous cultures, that the shaman would serve as the one who would psychologically stabilize the person. And I don't know how that would play out in the Mesoamerica per se. I don't know. Sure.
Any other questions? No? We're good? All right, I will let you guys go.
If you like, he's sharing a follow-up piece. It's only 20 minutes long. It's not very long. There is a scholar of esotericism named Justin Sledge, where he creates one of these older alchemical potions based on alchemical principles to treat melancholy. And he treats it in medieval, the way they would have done it back in the Renaissance age. If you want to watch him prepare that potion and maybe get a little bit of a capstone on our discussion, Chris has sent that out to you to look at.
Not
if you
yet,
wish.
but it'll go out.
It'll go out to you.
It'll go out in an announcement in case you want to watch it. All right.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.